and congratulations for this wonderful work you're making, or you're getting achieved along with the committee. Well, hello to the Women on the Silent Screen community. My name is Enrique Moreno Ceballos, Director of Mexico Silent Film Festival and PhD student at Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Today, I'm honored about chairing this panel called To Be the First in the company of Professor Emerita Ramona from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, whom I welcome gladly. Unfortunately, Xiaoyang could not be with us, but here we are. Coming right up is Ramona's presentation titled The Artful Masquerade of First Chinese Start, Lady Senmei.
Okay, thank you.
Corey Emerita from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Coming up next is my presentation titled Mrs. Gardner's Travels, or Mexico's First Women Exhibitor, which I'll be sharing in a mere moment. It is safe to say that Mexico's film history usually begins to be told with the arrival of the Lumiere agents to Mexico City and the first screenings achieved from the cinematograph. Although this is a very well-documented precedent, it is also safe to say that beginnings in film history are multiple and diverse, or at least they should be. What does it mean to be the first in a patriarchal society? For women and LGBTQ plus identities, this could mean an opportunity for resistance against rhetorical and physical violence in our present. Thus, to have found Mrs. Gardner, the first woman exhibitor in Mexico, means both a chance to transform Mexico's film history once again, and an opportunity to value the work of Mexican women exhibitors and curators in the present. So this story begins roughly a month after the Lumiere agents' first presentation in Mexico City took place. On September 8, 1896, arriving from New York and staying at the Jardín Hotel, Mrs. C.B. Gardner presented the first test screening of Edison's Vitascope, one of the rival inventions for the cinematograph. She presented it at the Orange Circus, a very popular attraction for Mexico City and other states within the country. There you have Orange Circus. The Mexican Herald described this moment as follows. There were present at the test, which was made for the benefit of the Herald representative, only Mrs. Gardner and her friend and assistant, Mr. Lawrence, Mr. Knight of the Electric Light Company, and Mr. Frank Beitia, chief engineer at Orange. There were half a dozen of the theater people in the parquet who generously applauded the efforts of Mr. Edison's fair representation as she gracefully handled the celluloid ribbons played deftly with the glittering and glancing light as it lighted up its beautiful and swift created pictures. From the very first moment of this test screening, Mrs. Gardner was recognized for her effective skills to handle the Vitascope. Such admiration from the press continued as she requested for a more powerful level of electricity at some point, establishing her nature as gracefully confident. The films screened at this test were May Irving Kiss, and the Carnival Dance. For a second test, also at Orange Circus, later that week, Mrs. Gardner presented other films from the Edison catalog, among them Mexican Knife's Duel and Annabelle, both from 1894. By September 13th, Mrs. Gardner took the Vitascope to the Principal Theater, one of the most important art spaces in Mexico City at the time. Her screenings took place at number 4 within the evening program, and the Mexican Herald reported that the house was packed, and as picture after picture was thrown on the screen, the applause was tremendous. I can only imagine Mrs. Gardner's satisfaction after having presented by then 2 successful test screenings at Orange Circus and a full house program at the Principal Theater. Fortunately, as in previous cases, the press reported the films shown during that night. They were Blacksmith Scene, The Carnival Dance, A Mexican Knife Duel, Serpentine Dance, Herald Square, and Hoyt's Milk White Flag. By the end of September, Mrs. Gardner finally offered a public presentation of the Vitascope at Orange Circus, after all of those tests. Unfortunately, the press reported that Mrs. Gardner and the circus management had a fallout, so they broke their commercial relationship. Soon after, her partner, Thomas O'Connor from the Vitascope Company, arrived in Mexico City in order to present the device at Guadalajara, and so he did. Mrs. Gardner, on the other hand, had a different travel plan. This way, she arrived in Puebla, one of the most important cities in Mexico, and by October 10th, she presented the Vitascope. The Two Republics newspaper report this as follows. The Vitascope has also arrived and arrangements are being made for the first exhibition tonight. It is under the direction of Mrs. C.B. Gardner and will be conducted on First Mercaderes Street, number 6. This marvelous exhibition of art that has astonished so many people in other parts of the world has yet to try its effects on the people of Puebla. And so she was in Mercaderes Street, holding on faithfully for the public to arrive, as reported by the press. The first week was a rough one, since heavy rains and damp air discouraged attendance. Fortunately, this changed quickly, and by October 24th, attendance was reported high. By the end of the month, the Two Republics newspaper reported the following. The Vitascope, under the direction of Mrs. Gardner, still lingers in Puebla, with reasonable success, but I learned that it will close out here tomorrow. And she did. Mrs. Gardner closed the Vitascope place and returned from Puebla to Mexico City, where she was seen on November 1st and 5th, attending the last concerts offered by the 21st Regiment Band, which played compositions from Cervantes, Navarro, Clement, Verdi, and Chic at the Hotel Jardín. The press that reported this also informs about the presence of H. Lawrence and Thomas O'Connor in these concerts. One must remember that these two people were identified as assistant and associate of Mrs. Gardner, respectively. I can only imagine Mrs. Gardner listening to this music. She must have felt very satisfied with her work after the success of her screenings in Mexico City and Puebla. She must have taken a pause to seize the moment and then think about the future, about all those other places she will later visit. By November 6th, she left Mexico City with her associate Thomas O'Connor in order to bring the Vitascope to cities and towns like Aguascalientes, Querétaro, León, Silao, San Luis Potosí, Zacatecas, and Chihuahua. At least this was the plan announced by the press. Whether they succeeded or not, well, that's a question I want to try to answer next. So far, Mrs. Gardner's travels, as I said earlier, transform once again Mexico's film history. From a regional perspective, in Mexico City, we had also the Lumiere brothers agents as initiators of the moving image. But in places like Puebla, where the cinematograph had not yet arrived, it was Mrs. Gardner who can be recognized as the first. Once again, I must clarify that my research does not intend to present an actual winner in a patriarchal competitive way. What I want is to complexify our film histories by considering gender a vital aspect of knowledge sharing in the context of feminist and trans-feminist causes that look for reference like Mrs. Gardner. To say that we, film exhibitors, are dignified workers is an understatement. Even more so if we are women or LGBTQ plus identities. For the moment, the experiences of Mrs. Gardner are a starting point for celebrating our history and also for my PhD dissertation, in which I have enlisted 5 other women film exhibitors that worked in Mexico. I'll be holding on faithfully, like Mrs. Gardner in her Puebla exhibition, for these stories to grow and to flourish in our memory garden. For closing, I want to especially recognize the research work of Jean-Claude Seguin, who had previously published about Mrs. Gardner in the Grupo de Reflexión sobre el Mundo Prehispánico website. Also, I want to thank Elifka Inakji for sharing this reference on the eve of the 4th Mexico Silent Film Festival back in 2019, making it the spark that started all. Thank you so much. Well, now it is time for our panel discussion. Thank you so much for your comments. Remember that for our panel discussion, everyone can share questions, comments, of course. I wonder if Ramona is still with us.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hello again, Ramona.
Sorry.
Don't worry. So I'll be throwing the first question. I'll be sharing it also in the chat. So everybody who wants to comment can do it. So I'll be asking first, why do you think that it is important to demonstrate Lady Chen-Mei and or Mrs. Gardner were the first in their respective transnational work fields? Why do you think that this is important?
I would say for Lady Chin-Mei, it's not that she was the first. If we're lucky, we'll find someone else earlier and elsewhere. But it's important to kind of make that point rhetorically counter to the popular discourse that always looks in the United States for a first, an origin moment. And that origin moment now is Anna May Wong. And so I want to disrupt that origin story, not by saying, oh, there were lots and not really. No, by very emphatically saying she was not the first. Here was the first. And now we can problematize the first. I put that in quotations. So it's a rhetorical strategy.
I totally love that. And I agree completely. I just love how we can play and disrupt and change the concept of the origins within silent cinema. Origins, initiators, pioneers. I think these are all concepts that they're just beginning to open up for changing, for transforming our stories. So I completely agree. And for Mrs. Gardner, I would say that this is important because once again, generation after generation, we have this women and LGBT plus communities that I think they all want to heard about these stories and to have this reference. So once again, it is really important that we open up in the front of these origins constantly changing.
Enrique, may I ask a question?
Yeah, of
Yes.
course.
So yes, I'm very interested to hear all about that. It's important research. Certainly, you mentioned five women exhibitors, early women exhibitors. That were any of the other five from Mexico, or can you characterize them a little bit, or also tell us anything more about Mrs. Gardner, how she came to Mexico City, or was she Mexican background and married to someone named Gardner, or what was the story there? Because I guess I think biography can prove interesting.
Yeah, of course, that is one of the next steps to find out about her biography. So far, I only know that she came from New York and that she probably came with 2 children, as reported by the press. I did not share this information because I am not 100% sure that it was the same Mrs. Gardner. I am like 90% sure, but I want to be 100% sure that she came with 2 children, since she had all this liberty for moving around. Anyway, I think if this turns out to be true, it could be great to think about her possibly as a single mom or a widow, or I don't know, all these terms that once again will intervene in our gender perspective. So yeah, that's all I know about Mrs. Gardner, but it is one of the next steps. And regarding the other exhibitors, yeah, they are all fascinating as well. The rest of them are Mexicans. Brígida González, who worked around 1899. Then you have Mrs. Refugio Barragán de Toscano, mother of Salvador Toscano, one of Mexican's film pioneers. And she worked around 1906. Then you have Cécile de Vanjour. Cécile worked around 1914. And finally, you have Adelina Barraza, who worked around 1923 and who has been published already by Laura Isabel Serna at the Women Film Pioneers Project. So I am really amazed by this possible research, a line that we can inaugurate by finding these women exhibitors, who are all marvelous, if you ask me.
Thank you.
Well, so regarding our pioneers, Ladies and May and Mrs. Gardner, here's the second question. Ramona, I'll be sharing it with the chat as well. What could have meant to be the first for Ladies and May and Mrs. Gardner in their respective patriarchal contexts?
I'll let you go first.
Okay. I think that for Mrs. Gardner, we are talking about power, since she came to Mexico under the role of commander-in-chief, practically. She was giving orders. She was being confident in the front of male managers, in the front of male assistants, and she was recognized as such by male newspapers reporters. So I think that it is important to know that Mrs. Gardner was exercising a working power in this transnational context. And I think that is really interesting. in a patriarchal Mexican 1896 context, I think, for Mrs. Gardner.
I would have to say that Lady Cine really was not first in her patriarchal context by any means. The rhetorical strategy of saying she was the first Chinese film star, which the newspapers claimed, or Chinese American film star, serves for my purposes largely to draw attention to her and make her a worthy subject, because if anything, often it's the first that are said, okay, that are given the most attention. But as on stage, there were many, many women, of course, as stars on the vaudeville stage or the performance stage. You know, already you have to look back to the 18th century and so forth. She also was far from the first. I mean, look at all the women appearing in film, including transition from stage to screen. But the distinction there is the Chinese element. So, which is something in the United States that gets emphasized, all of these, you know, kind of essentialized racial identities. And so one has to kind of depart from that assumption of its importance of an essential racial achievement and distinction to then explode that and show, in fact, it was an ongoing process, ongoing issue. So it's a very different answer. She wasn't really the first, because stage was not new and film was no longer new by the time she got into it. Unlike your figure, Mrs. Gardner, was working with a very new medium.
Well, that is interesting also, like to think about, once again, this concept, the first, in the light of a cross-cultural identity, like Ladies and Maids. It is really interesting because obviously this is a possibility to think about, for example, her success. And here it comes a third question. I would ask if it is possible that the cross-cultural identities, both of Ladies and May and Mrs. Gardner, were a critical element in their success. What do you think about it?
Certainly. I mean, as I was trying to demonstrate, May developed and promoted her exotic, having been from China and so forth, identity herself. Now, two reasons. First, if you're from China, who's going to ask you where you were born, who your parents were? When you say, okay, my father was a doctor, and you can't really find him. He's an unusual Chinese person, but okay, enough said. If she had said, like Anna May Wong, my father was a laundryman in Philadelphia, then I go visit him. And well, where's the mother? And who was the mother? You know, that kind of thing. So she avoided that by creating her own legend. And the Variety article is supposedly by Lady Cine May. Well, she may be a ghostwriter, or maybe she wrote it herself, or a lot of it. But that, in 1919, really created a legend for her film persona. She didn't have as much of a legend for her stage persona, except that she was Chinese and performed in these ways and spoke exceptionally good English for being someone Chinese. That's what the paper said. So she used that exoticism in both stage and film careers, but she used it, especially in the film phase, I think, more as a defense in part, rather than just a complement of her persona. And I would repeat that there were many Chinese men and women performing on the vaudeville stage. We know that from Kristen Moon and others. So she wasn't first in that context either. There were people already beginning around the turn of the century to the 20th century performing on stage. Dancers, impersonators of various sorts, comedic performers. So she built on what was already present on the stage, but she enhanced all of that to her own protection when she shifted to film. I'd say.
I just love the possibility that they have of inventing themselves or reinventing themselves in their particular work fields. And so for Mrs. Gardner, I would think that possibly being American, she was also advertised by the newspapers like this, because these specific newspapers were directed to the American colony in Mexico. So there is also an interesting fact that I am going to analyze in the future, how, Mrs. Gardner had certain benefits in part because of our colonial traces as Mexicans. This happens also with the Lumiere agents. They were glorified by the press, they were glorified by the president. And now we have Mrs. Gardner, so let's see how that turns out, analyzing the impact that the Vitascope presentation had in this American colony perception and cultural life, and for the Mexican community audiences as well.
Mhm.
I would reflect on that. I don't know if you have any other question, Ramona, or maybe the audience want to participate in the chat.
I could show that other clip I was mentioning from the letter, which is outrageous and funny, if you like.
Yes, please, in the context of our discussion,
Yes.
please.
Yeah, it is a little long, but we have time, and I'm glad my assistant is still here because I need the help. Like that. It's over here, like that. Further. That one. Sorry. And then I got to share my screen again, if I may. Is this okay with you, Long?
Yes, and it's okay to record this, or you prefer not?
It's a clip from it's out of copyright, I think, from 1929. Yeah, you could, if you wish it.
Okay.
It's a clip from the film, The Letter, and it comes toward the end. And so what has happened, just to give a little background, Herbert Marshall went at the command of Jean Ingalls' character, whose husband was off someplace else. They're both rubber plantation owners. And Jean Ingalls confronts him, and he says, I want to break up with you. I prefer Li Ti. And the Jean Ingalls white woman is outraged and kills him. So Herbert Marshall disappears within the first few minutes of the film, but there is that letter. And Li Ti now is without her protector and so forth. So she keeps the letter. Ultimately, I mean, it's not that she's an upstanding individual in many ways. She's a tiger like that. And she's also, in the way this film starts, she is a mongoose rather than a snake. I like that association, because this clip begins with some documentary stock footage of a mongoose fighting a snake, and the mongoose wins. So she wins this scene. So Ingalls is the snake and she is the mongoose, right? It's a different kind of pattern. She doesn't slither up, she fights directly. So she has had the letter, has let Mrs. Ingalls know who's on trial for his murder. And I think she kind of said, oh, some native came and I screamed and he killed the native, or the native killed him in my, whatever, some story. So, but she's in danger of being found guilty of his murder. And the letter would prove that. And so she wants to buy the letter back from Li Ti, who is now running a bordello, basically. So this is the scene in which the white lover, on defense of her life, goes to Li Ti to buy the letter. And it's just Li Ti, Lady Cin Mei just acts circles around her, if you ask me. So let's go to that clip. This is the stock footage of the mongoose and the snake. It's just stuck in the middle of the film with no sound. Early Disney nature film, I guess. Haha. So this is Jean Ingalls, who was a very well-known star at the time, acted in the East, but she died later the year the film was made of a drug overdose.
Đâu có còn mà nói ngồi chút sớm thì anh thành ở đâu đó phải đặt sầu khó lại.
I don't know how good her Cantonese or Chinese pronunciation is. She did not speak
One moment,
Chinese
please.
much.
You wish to speak to Liti? Yes, I do. So. Well, you know who I am. Oh, yes. You know why I'm here. I expected you. Right. But there is no hurry. Sit down. Make yourself at home. Don't be that. I've come here for my letter. Here's your money. Oh, yes. That's so very funny. Letter. Look here. One moment, please.
Đúng tôi cái một tay lên đại con người ta ca còn đúng tới đại ta cao hầm đó mà tới nó bò đó.
How dare you let that man in while I'm here? High-up white lady think too good for DT's house. Give me my letter directly. Maybe DT think her house too good for white lady. This horrible place, why did I ever come here? You come to buy your life. Very well. If I did, let us come to business. It's $10,000 you want, isn't it? Here it is. Here. White lady very proud, but not too proud to share same man with the DT. Chinese woman, you horrible Chinese woman, but not to Mr. Hammond. Many love names he had for me. Shall I tell you some of them? Stop it, please. Can't be possible here to touch a vile yellow thing like you. It is possible. That is why you killed Mr. Hammond. Here, take that money. Take that money, I tell you, and give me my letter. Oh, yes. Because he loved me. That is why you killed Mr. Hammond. Don't mention his name again. Don't mention his name again, I tell you. Cheat woman. Liar woman. Murder woman. Maybe I not give you back your letter. Maybe I let you hang for killing Mr. Hammond. All right. All right, just keep the letter. Keep it. I'd rather hang, I think, than hear you mention his name again. Let me out of here. Let me out, I tell you. But your husband.
Okay. Get that.
Thank you for sharing this magnificent clip, Ramona. And well, regarding Ladies in May, we have some questions by the audience.
Mhm.
For example, Christine Harris says, what a fascinating presentations. Thank you. Ramona, can you talk about your experience interviewing her daughter, Merita? What aspects of the life and career did this open up? Also, if Josephine, Lady May, was raised in a culturally Chinese American context, her foster family since age 1, to what extent was she aware of having a different birth mother with a different cultural genealogical background?
Why don't I answer that first about her own knowledge? I don't know how soon she learned more about her birth mother, but when she went to Australia in 1916, she had to apply for an American passport. And that was so that primarily and establish an immigration dossier. Why? Not because she was an immigrant, but because she wasn't. as a Chinese person, in order to be able to be assured of being able to return to the United States, she needed to have established in advance that she was an American citizen. So she went to get a passport and go through that research process, as Anna May Wong did too before she went abroad. And in the process, the immigration authorities, and this Scott Seligman found a lot of this in original records before they were on Ancestry.com, he found that she had a birth brother, and you had to get letters. So she was able to get someone who knew her as a child at the laundry to write a letter to the immigration authorities and say, yes, I knew this child. She was really, and it was cross-referenced to her brother's records, which say in very direct kind of racial physiognomy terms, we accept that he is American because he looks part Black. Look at him, they say, and he looks part Black. And because he told the story of, he knew his birth mother's name and her background being from Norfolk, Virginia, and all that basically slave, kind of descendant history. And so then that was cross-referenced to her file. And so this whole family history is in immigration records. And that came out when she wanted in 1916, so she was in her late 20s then, to go abroad. And so by then, and there's letters between her, answered to her and this wonderful Methodist layman who was trying to help them. The story is also, he tried to get them into an orphanage, the 3 children, and the father didn't want to let the son especially go. But he said the problem is they went to the orphanage, the Methodist orphanage, and the orphanage said, we take Chinese children, but not Black children. So they were recognized. Now, after her adoption by a white mother who didn't speak Chinese and her Chinese father, who was well educated and such, and spoke excellent English and such, so she would have grown up in that environment. After that, she may have lost track in her mind and some things, but certainly by her late 20s, she was finding these things out. And so she would have known, and her husband was from Virginia, her first husband. And he, I think he found out probably in her greater age, maybe they just didn't get along, but also she was stuck in Montreal in 1925 and had to go through the dossier immigration again. And she was married then. So he may have found out in 1925 to get her back into the country from Canada. So that's what I meant. There are hints and behind the scenes kinds of things. So she would have known part of the time. Did her daughter know? I'm not ready like you. I'm not ready to print it yet. I'm not definite 100%, but I have found Merita Moore.
I wonder if Ramona froze, or is it my connection?
Yeah, I think she froze. Just wait.
Okay, let's wait, if you agree, Yulong, for a few seconds, minutes, so she can get back. So let's wait for a few minutes. In the meantime, thank you all for your comments and questions regarding Ramona's presentation. I'm astonished, I'm wondered by the story of Lady Senmei, and the possibilities of comparing it with Mrs. Gardner's in a transnational and cross-cultural way, since they were both these figures of power, from a point of once again a transnational identity. Maybe Ramona won't be back. We don't know. I'll be glad about asking questions regarding Mrs. Gardner, if you have any. Oh, Ramona's back.
I got dropped off somehow. I'm sorry, I got dropped off midway through. Yeah,
Don't worry, welcome back. So you were saying we lost you after you said, I have found Merita.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so she was living in Florida, and I did you hear me when I said she was performing somewhat in blackface? Merita was, as a dancer in the 1930s. Yeah, and then she married at 18 and told me because she would have felt, you know, exploited by men otherwise. She married a young man who was white, and they lived in Norfolk, Virginia, because he was in the Navy. And so I find it quite interesting that in the end, May went to move in Norfolk because her only child was there, and that was where her mother was from, although she may not have known that. So I was saying that Merita would have known something of her history, even though she was only 1/16 Black or so. I mean, there was some kind of way in which, but she did not pass that knowledge or information along to her own children. She had 2 children, and to their children. And her May's great-grandchildren, and one of them had lived in the Chicago area where I live, but had contacted me at one point and said, I hear you know some about my ancestors. So I shared carefully a little bit of information, and that was kind of the last I heard. So I'm not sure, you know, what the knowledge is if they go to 23andMe, DNA tests, or whatever they want to do with it. They're interested in her career, but they were believing everything. And so the obituary I shared, Merita wrote that, and it's full of all that misinformation about all the various things, you know, Columbia University and all that. So it became a private legend as well as a public legend. But Merita, it was quite interesting. She heard, even at 95, when I spoke to her, 95 years old, her hearing was good. She said, my sight is bad, but my hearing is still good. I said, great, we can have a good conversation. And I sent her then the film, The Letter. Right? But she said, well, I won't be able to watch it. I said, well, have your daughter who lived there narrate it. And the upshot is, she said she appeared as an extra in The Letter, as a child extra. So there were other things she told me, but it's hard to know, and this is your situation. You do this research, you find out things that maybe are somewhat private, or maybe the relatives don't want to know. And then the question is, how certain are you? How important is it to the argument? What do you really share? You know, so I know more than I share. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ramona. Christine also has a question regarding Mrs. Gardner. She says, Enrique, I wonder if you were able to find any other biographical info about Mrs. Gardner's background. No, this is all very, very new. The finding of Mrs. Gardner is very recent, I would say, and I may invoke all of your help so I can trace back her possible ancestry, her family, her own name, since we only know her like Mississippi Gardner. Sometimes she is identified as Mrs. C.P. Gardner. So all this is a very important mission for me. So yes, it is possible. I'll be invoking your help soon. All of your help. Yes, Ramona.
Yes, may I share one last slide? I meant to, and then my time, I was certainly over long anyway. If I can share, this is kind of a credits besides the scholars. Here's a kind of credits slide. If I can get it done. I had this assistant and now she's gone, my daughter. So I don't know if people can can see this or not. It's my last slide. Well, it's not showing up, so I'll just say what's on it. So some of the data sources I got for the star image sources were the Media History Digital Library, which is free, and mediahistoryproject.org is the email or the website. Chronicling America, which is a free newspaper database for American newspapers. And that's something the Library of Congress has done with the National Endowment for the Humanities. And that you can find under Chronicling, CHRONICLING, America, just those words, even separate in Chronicling America, libraryofcongress.gov will come up. Also ProQuest historical newspapers, for which you sometimes need a library subscription, and newspapers.com. So that's for the public persona. For the personal information, other than the hints I got in the newspapers, like her child was born, it was announced in the vaudeville press that she'd had a daughter and what her name was, and it was in San Antonio and so forth. And Merita told me, oh yeah, the story was she was pregnant within 2 weeks of birth and still performing on stage in her Chinese gowns. And she said, I need time off to have a baby. And they went, you're not pregnant enough, keep going. So she wore, Merita told me her mother, this is a family story, wore a tight-fitting Western style gown, which showed how pregnant she was. So then the boss let her take time off like that. But that was the personal stories. Otherwise, I use ancestry.com a lot. And that's actually based in Nevada, Salt Lake, but it's through the Latter-day Saints, kind of church, but they have access and provide a really convenient interface to lots of American national records. Ships, you could probably find Mrs. Gardner leaving, it depends how she went, by train, or if she went from New Orleans by boat, or whatever, seeing her in transit, when she arrived, when she left, because the ship's manifests, census records, marriage license records for many states, school directories, there's a tremendous amount of information there, and the immigration records are all published, to the web there. And that does require a subscription. And if you want global, it's like $300 some odd a year, but you can do it monthly, or you can get a short term, I think 1 week for free to try it out. And so you can really gather a lot that Mr. Seligman, who initially found out about the immigration records, he went to Philadelphia and he sat in a library and used, he had to do it by hand. It was that, but now at home, touch of a finger, you can find that material. So you might want to subscribe to ancestry.com for a month and just really find everything you could, and then turn it off, and then you save money.
I definitely will, Ramona. Thank you so much. Yeah, it is really important for me, and well, now for us to find out more about Mrs. Gardner, who she were, and so who was, of course, Lady Chen Mei. So we're closing now our panel. Adele Clark had a question also in the chat, if you can find it there, so you can possibly answer via email or via the chat as well, Ramona. And the comments keep coming also in the chat.
And see, I've lost that somehow. Let's see, I have to do my, I'm kind of made a mess of things. I needed my assistant and she had to go to work, but like that. You know what, let me just say this then, because I may lose the chat. And oh, there it is. Okay, sorry. I've done Zooming, but never as host. And so I don't have the access down pat. I'm not, especially when I'm feeling,
oh,
on the spot.
Adele Clark says she thinks her question was answered.
Okay.
So she thanks you. So this is
but
the
people are welcome to email me if they wish. If they wish to send me, and it's just my name. I'm not my university address, which I don't look at so much because I'm retired, but doing this, my name, all small, no spaces, at att.net. So Ramona Curry at att.net. And if people have questions, then we could converse. And you and I too, as we do.
Thank you. Of
Thank you,
course,
Enrique.
I will share my email with all of you as well. Enrique Ceballos, 89gmail.com. There you have also Ramona's email. It has been really a pleasure for
Thank
us
you,
today.
Enrique. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ramona. Thank you, Yulong. Thank you, everybody. Maggie Henfeld, who
Thank you so much.
as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Goodbye. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Enjoy.
Thank you.